Sometimes the hardest winters bring the most unexpected blessings. When a man loses all hope of ever having a family, fate delivers second chances through unlikely circumstances. Wyoming Territory, 1887. Caleb Dunn rides home through a brutal blizzard with only his faithful donkey beside him, expecting another lonely night. Instead, he finds a young woman collapsed in the snow, a mail-order bride whose intended husband had died, leaving her stranded and alone with nowhere to go. What begins as simple human decency becomes something neither expected. Trapped together by the storm, two broken souls start to heal. But can a cowboy who's forgotten how to trust and a woman with nothing left build something real from their shattered dreams? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like every other morning in the 5 years since Caleb Dunn had built his cabin on the eastern edge of Ridgeway. He woke before dawn, started the fire, and made coffee strong enough to strip paint from a fence post. The routine was comfort and prison both, predictable, solitary, safe. Outside, the Wyoming wind carried the smell of coming snow. Caleb stood on his narrow porch and studied the sky with the practiced eye of a man whose survival depended on reading weather. Heavy gray clouds pressed down from the north, and the air had that peculiar stillness that came before a storm. He had maybe 6 hours before it hit, 8 if he was lucky. "Morning, Ned," he said to the donkey who stood in the small corral, ears twitching at the sound of his voice. Ned was a grey burro with a white muzzle and a disposition somewhere between stubborn and ornery. Caleb had won him in a card game 3 years back from a prospector who swore the animal was more trouble than he was worth. The prospector had been right, but Ned was also loyal, sure-footed, and the closest thing Caleb had to family. He fed Ned, checked the water trough, and went back inside to fry eggs and bacon. The cabin was small but well built. One main room with a sleeping alcove, a stone fireplace, a table with 2 chairs that had never seated 2 people at once. His father's tools hung on one wall. His mother's recipe book sat on a shelf, pages water-stained and warped. Untouched since the day he'd packed it along with everything else he couldn't bear to leave behind when he fled Pennsylvania. That had been 6 years ago. 6 years since the fever took both his parents within a week of each other. 6 years since Margaret returned his engagement ring with a letter explaining that while she cared for him, she couldn't wait for a man who'd become a ghost in his own life. 6 years since he'd sold the family farm, packed what fit in 2 bags, and headed west with no plan except to get as far from his grief as possible. He'd found work on cattle ranches, learned to rope and ride, and eventually saved enough to claim this piece of land at the territory's edge. It wasn't much, 40 acres of scrub grass and rocky soil, but it was his. He made his living hiring out to neighboring spreads for seasonal work, fixing what needed fixing, doing what needed doing. The townspeople of Ridgeway respected him for his work ethic and left him alone otherwise, which suited him fine. Caleb finished his breakfast, washed his plate, and prepared for the ride into town. He needed supplies before the storm hit: flour, sugar, coffee, kerosene. Enough to last through however long the weather kept him cabin-bound. He took down his father's bridle from its peg by the door. It was old leather, hand-stitched, the buckles worn smooth with use. His father had made it 40 years ago, back in Pennsylvania before Caleb was born. Every time Caleb handled it, he remembered his father's hands, strong, patient, careful with the small things. He saddled Ned, who protested the cold with a long bray that echoed across the empty land. "I know," Caleb told him, "but we need supplies, and you're better company than staying here alone." The ride to Ridgeway took an hour. The town wasn't much to speak of. A main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, a boarding house, and maybe 24 buildings scattered around the edges. Maybe 200 people called it home, most of them as hard-scrabble and weathered as the land itself. Caleb tied Ned outside Havisham's general store and went inside. The proprietor, George Havisham, was a round man with a grey beard and a tendency to gossip. "Storm coming," George said by way of greeting. "Looks that way. Heard the Hensley place finally sold, or will sell, once they sort out the legalities." Caleb selected a sack of flour, not particularly interested in town business. "That so?" "Yep, poor Jacob Hensley. Dead not 3 weeks, and already they're dividing up what little he had. Pneumonia, they say. Found him in his cabin, stiff as a board. Had a mail-order bride coming, too. Wonder if anyone ever told her not to bother making the trip." Caleb paused, a can of coffee in his hand. Jacob Hensley had been a homesteader, claimed land about 2 miles from Caleb's cabin. They'd shared perhaps a dozen words in as many months. "That's rough," he said, because some comment seemed required. George rang up his purchases with relish, clearly hoping for more conversation, but Caleb paid and left without encouraging him. He stopped by the saloon for a quick whiskey to ward off the cold, nodded to a few ranch hands he knew, and headed back out into the biting wind. The ride home was harder. The temperature had dropped, and the first snowflakes were beginning to fall, small and dry, blowing horizontal in the wind. Ned plodded steadily, his breath steaming in the cold air. Caleb pulled his coat tighter and thought about the fire he'd have going within the hour, the warmth of his cabin, the long evening ahead with nothing but his own thoughts for company. That's when Ned stopped walking. "Come on," Caleb said, tugging the reins. "Not now," but Ned planted his hooves and refused to move. His ears swiveled forward, focused on something ahead in the gathering snow. Caleb squinted through the white curtain of falling flakes. They were passing the Hensley property, or what used to be the Hensley property. The small cabin sat dark and abandoned, its door hanging open and banging in the wind. "Ned, let's go." Then he saw it, a dark shape in the snow, maybe 20 yards from the cabin. His heart kicked hard in his chest. He dismounted, legs stiff from the cold, and walked toward the shape with growing dread. It was a woman. She lay on her side, curled against the wind, her skirts and cloak crusted with ice. Snow had already begun to drift against her body. "Ma'am?" Caleb dropped to his knees beside her, pulling off his glove to press his fingers against her throat. Pulse, faint and slow, but there. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Her lips were blue, her face deathly pale. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair plastered to her skull by melting snow. Beside her in the snow was a carpet bag, sodden and half-buried. Caleb didn't think. There wasn't time to think. He stripped off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her, then lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, or maybe fear gave him strength. Her head lolled against his shoulder. "Stay with me," he said, though he didn't know if she could hear him. "Just stay with me." He carried her to Ned, who stood patient and steady as stone. Getting her onto the donkey's back while she was unconscious, and he was shaking with cold and adrenaline, took longer than he wanted. But Ned didn't so much as shift his weight. Caleb grabbed the carpetbag with one hand, took Ned's reins with the other, and started walking as fast as the snow would allow. The storm hit in earnest before they'd gone half a mile. The wind howled like something alive and hungry, driving snow so thick Caleb could barely see Ned's ears. He kept one hand on the woman, keeping her steady on Ned's back, and trusted his feet to follow the path home. The cold bit through his shirt, and his hands went numb inside his gloves. When the dark shape of his cabin finally emerged from the white, he nearly sobbed with relief. He half-carried, half-dragged the woman inside, kicking the door shut against the wind. The fire had burned down to embers, but the cabin was still warmer than outside. He laid her on his bed and went to work. First, the fire. He built it up fast, feeding it until flames roared in the hearth. Then he turned to the woman. Her clothes were soaked through, her skin like ice. Hypothermia. He'd seen it before on the trail, knew the signs, knew what happened if you didn't act fast. He stripped the wet clothes from her with shaking hands, trying not to think about propriety or impropriety, focused only on survival. He wrapped her in every blanket and quilt he owned, piled them on until only her face showed, then dragged the whole bundle closer to the fire. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse still faint. Caleb heated water and used cloths to warm her hands and feet, careful not to do it too fast. He'd heard about frostbite, about the damage that could happen if you warmed frozen flesh too quickly. Her fingers were white at the tips, her toes the same. He worked methodically, warming the water, wringing out the cloths, applying steady heat. Hours passed. The storm raged outside, battering the cabin walls. Caleb kept the fire high and stayed beside the woman, monitoring her breathing, checking her pulse, willing her to live. Sometime after midnight, her eyelids flickered open. Her eyes were brown, confused, frightened. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. "You're safe," Caleb said quickly. "You're in my cabin. I found you in the snow by the Hensley place. You're safe now." Her eyes closed again. Her lips formed a single word: "Gone." "Who's gone?" But she didn't answer. She slipped back into unconsciousness, though her breathing seemed a little stronger now, her pulse more steady. Caleb allowed himself a moment of hope. He checked on Ned. The donkey was in the small lean-to barn, dry and unconcerned, then came back inside to keep vigil. He sat by the fire, watching the woman sleep, and wondered who she was, and what had brought her to Jacob Hensley's door in the middle of a blizzard. The carpetbag sat by the door where he'd dropped it. Caleb hesitated, then retrieved it. If she died, and she still might, someone would need to know who she was, who to notify. He opened the bag carefully. Inside were a few pieces of clothing, all cheaply made but well-maintained. A worn Bible with a name written inside the cover, Clara Brennan. A small bundle of letters tied with string, and a tintype photograph of a man, middle-aged, serious-faced, standing beside a cabin that Caleb recognized. Jacob Hensley. Caleb untied the letters and read the top one. It was dated 3 months earlier, from Jacob Hensley to Clara Brennan in Philadelphia. He wrote about his homestead, his plans, his hope for a partner to share the work and the life. He wrote about the beauty of Wyoming, the challenge of it, the opportunity. He wrote with a kind of desperate optimism that made Caleb's chest ache. The next letter was Clara's response. She wrote about her situation. An orphan, no family, working in a textile factory for wages that barely kept her fed. She wrote about her hope for a new start, her willingness to work hard, her gratitude for the opportunity. She wrote with careful dignity, asking nothing but offering everything. The correspondence continued through the summer and into fall. Jacob Hensley's letters grew warmer, more personal. He was clearly a lonely man, hoping this stranger from the East might become something more than a housekeeper. Clara's letters remained practical but kind, accepting his proposal of marriage, making plans for the journey west. The last letter was from Jacob, dated 4 weeks ago. He wrote about preparing the cabin for her arrival, about his excitement, about the future he hoped they'd build together. He must have died within days of sending it. Caleb looked at the woman sleeping in his bed, Clara Brennan, mail-order bride to a dead man. She traveled across the country to find a home and a husband, and instead found an empty cabin and a Wyoming winter. No wonder she'd collapsed in the snow. The shock alone might have killed her, even without the cold. He set the letters aside and added more wood to the fire. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, Clara Brennan slept on, and Caleb Dunn kept watch, wondering what in God's name he was supposed to do when she woke up. By the second day, the storm showed no sign of letting up. Snow piled against the cabin walls. The wind screamed like a living thing. Caleb could barely make it to the barn to feed Ned and check the water. The world had shrunk to the cabin, the fire, and the unconscious woman who slept through it all. He melted snow for water, rationed his supplies, and tried not to think about how long they might be trapped here together. 1 week, too? The storm felt like it had no end, like the sky had decided to empty itself of every snowflake it had been saving. Clara stirred occasionally, murmuring in her sleep, but didn't fully wake. Caleb kept warming her hands and feet, encouraged when he saw the color returning to her skin. The frostbite wasn't as bad as he'd feared. She'd been lucky, if you could call any of this lucky. On the 3rd day, she woke. Caleb was tending the fire when he heard her voice, soft and uncertain. "Where am I?" He turned. She was sitting up slightly, the blankets clutched around her, her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders. Her eyes were clearer now, focused and aware. "My cabin," Caleb said. "About 2 miles from the Hensley place. I'm Caleb Dunn. I found you in the snow 3 days ago. She looked around slowly, taking in the small room, the fire, the storm still raging outside. 3 days? Yes, ma'am. You were near frozen when I found you. How are you feeling? Cold. She shivered despite the blankets. And confused. I remembered. Her face crumpled. Jacob Hensley. He's dead. I know. I'm sorry. I traveled so far. Her voice was barely a whisper. I sold everything I owned to buy the train ticket. I borrowed money I can't repay for the rest. I came all this way, and he was already... She stopped, pressing her hands to her face. Caleb stood awkwardly, unsure what to do. Comfort wasn't something he knew how to offer. He'd spent too many years alone, too many years avoiding exactly this kind of raw emotion. But she was crying now quietly, her shoulders shaking, and he couldn't just stand there like a fence post. He poured water from the pot over the fire, added a pinch of tea leaves, precious and rationed, and brought the cup to her. Here, he said, drink this. She took the cup with trembling hands, sipped, and closed her eyes. Thank you for the tea, for saving my life. She gestured helplessly at the cabin, at him. All of it just did what anyone would do. Not anyone. She looked at him directly for the first time, and he saw strength in her eyes beneath the grief. Most people would have ridden past. It was a bad storm. You risked your life to save mine. Caleb shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude.
You hungry?
Starving, actually. He made oatmeal with a little sugar and dried fruit, plain food but warm and filling. She ate slowly, as if remembering how. He sat across from her at the table, drinking coffee, trying not to stare. I looked in your bag, he said finally. Had to know who you were in case... He stopped, in case I died. She said it matter-of-factly. I understand. You read the letters? Some of them. I'm sorry for your loss. Jacob Hensley was a decent man, from what little I knew of him. Clara nodded. His letters were kind. I thought... She stopped, set down her spoon. I thought I'd have a home, a purpose, maybe even a family someday. Instead, I have nothing. Less than nothing. I owe money I can't repay. I have no way to get back east, and no home to return to if I could. I'm completely and utterly alone. The way she said it, calm, resigned, without self-pity, hit Caleb harder than tears would have. He recognized that tone. He'd heard it in his own voice for years. The storm's not letting up any time soon, he said. Could be a week or more before it's safe to travel. You'll stay here until it clears. After that, he hesitated. After that, we'll figure something out. I can't impose on you. You're not imposing. You're surviving. There's a difference. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Thank you, Mr. Dunn. Caleb, just Caleb. Thank you, Caleb. I'm Clara. I know. He managed a small smile. Saw it in your Bible. The storm raged on. Days blurred together. Caleb gave Clara his bed and slept by the fire on a bedroll. It wasn't comfortable, but he'd slept in worse places. The cabin felt smaller with 2 people in it, but not in a bad way. Just different. Strange to hear another person breathing, moving, existing in the space he'd kept so carefully empty. Clara proved surprisingly resilient. By the 4th day, she was up and moving around, insisting on helping despite his protests. She washed dishes, folded blankets, organized things that didn't need organizing. Caleb understood. She needed to feel useful, to feel like less of a burden. He'd felt the same way once, in the early days after his parents died, when Margaret's family had taken him in, and he'd worked himself ragged, trying to prove he deserved their kindness. On the 5th day, Clara found his mother's recipe book. It was sitting on the shelf where it had sat for 5 years, untouched and gathering dust. She pulled it down carefully, blowing off the dust, and opened to a random page. "May I?" she asked, holding it up. Caleb felt something twist in his chest. He'd avoided that book like it carried plague. Couldn't bear to look at his mother's handwriting, at the recipes she'd made 100 times, at the little notes she'd written in the margins. But Clara was looking at him hopefully, and he found himself nodding. "Sure, if you want." That evening she made stew. Not just any stew. His mother's stew, the recipe she'd made every Sunday when he was a boy. Beef and potatoes and carrots, flavored with thyme and bay leaf, thick and rich and perfect. The smell alone nearly undid him. They ate in silence, and Caleb had to set his spoon down more than once because his hands were shaking. Every bite was memory, his mother's kitchen, his father reading by the fire, the life he'd had before fever and grief had torn it all apart. "Is it all right?" Clara asked, worried by his silence. "It's perfect," he managed. "Exactly how she used to make it." "Your mother?" He nodded. "She died 6 years ago. My father too. Same week, fever, I'm so sorry. Long time ago now, but it wasn't really." Grief didn't care about time. Clara reached across the table and touched his hand, just briefly. "Thank you for sharing this with me. The recipe, I mean. It must be hard to—" "It is, but I'm glad you did. Feels right somehow. Like she'd want her recipes used, not just sitting on a shelf collecting dust." They talked more that night than they had since she'd woken. Clara told him about her childhood in Philadelphia, growing up in an orphanage after her parents died of cholera when she was 8. She told him about working in the textile factory, about the loneliness of a life without family, about the desperate hope that had driven her to answer Jacob Hensley's advertisement. Caleb found himself telling her things he hadn't spoken aloud in years, about his parents, about Margaret, about the way he'd run from his grief instead of facing it, about the cabin, the land, the lonely years of trying to convince himself that solitude was the same as peace. "Do you think it worked?" Clara asked. "Running from grief?" "No," he admitted. "Just postponed it. But I'm not sure facing it would have been any easier. Maybe it's not about easy or hard. Maybe it's just about surviving long enough to realize you want more than survival." The words hung in the air between them, true and uncomfortable. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the fire crackled. And two strangers who'd had every reason to give up began tentatively to hope. A week passed. Then another. The storm broke occasionally, giving glimpses of blue sky before closing in again with fresh fury. The cabin became its own small world, and they became its only inhabitants. Caleb showed Clara how to tend the fire properly, how to ration supplies, how to read the weather in the quality of the wind. Clara cooked from the recipe book, each meal a small resurrection of Caleb's mother's kitchen. She mended his shirts, patched his worn trousers, brought order to corners of the cabin that had been neglected for years. They developed routines. Morning coffee together, quiet and comfortable. Breakfast, then chores. Caleb would brave the storm to tend Ned and check the supplies in the lean-to. Clara would clean, cook, and, when she found scraps of fabric in an old trunk, began sewing. Evenings were the best part. They'd sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes just existing in companionable silence. Clara would read aloud from the Bible or from the one book Caleb owned, a collection of Shakespeare plays his mother had loved. Her voice was clear and warm, and Caleb found himself looking forward to those readings, the way he used to look forward to his mother's bedtime stories when he was a child. It was during one of those evenings that Clara found Jacob Hensley's unsent letter. She'd been going through her carpet bag, organizing what little she owned, when she discovered it tucked in an inside pocket she'd missed before. "Oh," she said softly, holding it up. This was for me." Caleb looked up from the piece of leather he'd been working into a new rein for Ned's bridle. "You want privacy to read it?" She shook her head. "Would you mind if I read it aloud? I think I need to hear it out loud somehow, to make it real, if that's what you need." She unfolded the letter carefully, as if it might crumble. Her voice was steady as she began to read. "Dear Clara, I hope this letter finds you well and not too weary from your journey. I've been preparing the cabin for your arrival, making it as comfortable as I can, though I know it won't compare to what you're used to in the city. I've never been much with words, so forgive me if this sounds clumsy. I'm excited to meet you. More than excited, hopeful, I think. Hopeful that we might build something good here together. I know we're starting as strangers, but I believe the best partnerships are built on shared work and mutual respect, and I promise you both of those. I'll do everything in my power to be a good husband to you, Clara, to honor you and provide for you and make you glad you took this chance. The land here is hard but beautiful. The work is endless but rewarding. And I think, with you beside me, I might finally build the home I've been dreaming of. I'll be waiting at the station when your train arrives. Until then, I remain hopefully yours, Jacob. Clara's voice broke on the last word. She folded the letter carefully and set it in her lap. He seemed kind. He was, Caleb said quietly. From what I knew of him, I can't help wondering. She stopped, pressed her lips together. What if he hadn't died? What if I'd arrived to find him waiting like he promised? Would I have been happy? Would he? No way to know. No. She looked at the letter again, then at Caleb. But I think I might have been. He wrote with such hope, such genuine hope. It's been so long since anyone hoped for anything with me. Caleb wanted to say something, to offer comfort or wisdom or anything useful. But what did he know about hope? He'd spent 5 years avoiding it like poison. So instead, he just said his loss was... He stopped, the words catching. His loss was my... He couldn't finish it, couldn't say what he was thinking, that Jacob Hensley's death had brought Clara here to this cabin to him. That he was glad she was alive, even though it cost a decent man his life. That he was starting to look forward to her presence in ways that felt dangerous and inevitable all at once. Clara seemed to understand anyway. She looked at him across the firelight, and something passed between them. Acknowledgement, recognition, the beginning of something neither of them were ready to name. Thank you, she said simply, for giving me a place to grieve, for not rushing me or judging me or... She gestured at the letter. For letting me feel whatever I need to feel. That's what people do, Caleb said. Or should do, anyway. You'd be surprised how rare it is. They sat in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Warmer somehow, more honest. And when Clara finally stood to go to bed, she paused beside his chair and touched his shoulder briefly, just a moment of connection, before she disappeared behind the alcove curtain. Caleb sat by the fire long after she'd gone to sleep, watching the flames and thinking about letters and hope and the strange ways life could shift beneath your feet when you least expected it. The storm finally broke on the 11th day. Caleb woke to silence, not the howling wind he'd grown accustomed to, but actual silence. He lay in his bedroll for a moment, disoriented, then got up and opened the door. Blue sky. Clear and cold and infinite. Snow piled 3 feet deep in every direction, smooth and unmarked, except for animal tracks. The world had been scrubbed clean, made new. It stopped, Clara said behind him. She'd come to stand in the doorway, wrapped in one of his blankets. The storm stopped. Looks that way. They stood together looking out at the transformed landscape. Caleb felt something shift in his chest. Relief that they'd survived, certainly, but also something else. Something like disappointment that the storm was over, that the small world of the cabin would now have to expand to include reality again. What happens now? Clara asked quietly. Now I dig us out. Make sure Ned's all right. Check the supplies. Then he hesitated. Then we figure out what comes next. It took most of the day to dig a path to the lean-to. Ned was fine, if annoyed at having been confined for so long. Caleb fed him extra oats as an apology and checked him over carefully. No injuries, no illness. The old donkey was tough as nails. Clara made dinner from the last of the fresh vegetables. They'd have to ration carefully until Caleb could get to town. As they ate, they talked around the subject that mattered most. What would Clara do now? Finally, Clara set down her fork and addressed it directly. I should go to town. Find the boarding house. Look for work. What kind of work? I don't know. Whatever's available. Washing, cleaning, cooking. I'm not afraid of hard work. Clara... Caleb stopped, unsure how to say what he was thinking. There might not be work. Not much call for extra hands in a town this size, especially in winter. Then I'll figure something else out. You could... He took a breath. You could stay here. Through the winter, at least. As a housekeeper, if you want to call it that. I'll pay you what I can, and you'll have room and board. Come spring, if you want to go, you can. But at least you'd be warm and fed until then. Clara looked at him carefully. Why would you do that? Because the cabin felt like a home for the first time in 5 years. Because her voice reading Shakespeare made him remember what joy sounded like. Because the thought of her leaving made the walls close in on him like a coffin. But he couldn't say any of that. So instead he said, because it's the practical thing to do. I could use the help, and you need a place to stay. Simple business arrangement. People will talk. Let them. Your reputation, I don't have a reputation to protect. And even if I did, I don't much care what people think. Clara studied him for a long moment, and Caleb had the uncomfortable feeling she could see right through his practical excuses to the truth beneath. But she didn't call him on it. Instead, she nodded slowly. All right. But I pay my own way. I work for my keep, and we keep this proper and professional. Separate spaces, clear boundaries, agreed. Agreed. They shook hands on it, formal and awkward, and Caleb tried to ignore the way his heart jumped when her palm pressed against his. 2 days later, they made the trip to town. The going was slow. 3 feet of snow made for difficult travel, and they had to stop frequently to rest Ned. But the sky stayed clear, and by early afternoon they reached Ridgeway's main street. The town was digging itself out, people shoveling walkways and assessing damage. Several buildings had lost parts of their roofs to the weight of snow, but overall, everyone had weathered the storm well enough. Caleb tied Ned outside the general store and helped Clara down from the sledge he'd rigged up. She'd put on her best dress, a dark blue wool that was worn but clean, and pinned her hair up carefully. She looked respectable, dignified, nothing like the half-frozen woman he'd found in the snow. Inside, George Havisham's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. Here was gossip delivered right to his doorstep. Caleb Dunn, heard you rode out before the storm. We worried you might not have made it back. Made it fine. Caleb set a basket on the counter. Need supplies, flour, coffee, sugar, salt, kerosene. George's eyes kept sliding to Clara, who stood quietly beside Caleb, her hands folded in front of her. And who's this? Clara Brennan, Caleb said. She was engaged to Jacob Hensley. Arrived to find him already past. She'll be staying at my place through winter as housekeeper. He said it matter-of-factly, as if it were the most natural arrangement in the world. George's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline, but before he could comment, Clara spoke up. I'm very grateful to Mr. Dunn for his kindness. If you know of anyone in town who needs sewing or mending done, I'd be happy to take on work. I'm quite skilled with a needle. It was smartly done, presenting herself as a businesswoman, making it clear she intended to work, not just live off Caleb's charity. George looked slightly disappointed that there wasn't more scandal to mine. I'll ask around, he said, though work's scarce this time of year. They purchased the supplies and moved on to the boarding house. Mrs. Kelly, the proprietor, was a thin woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She listened to Clara's story, edited for propriety, and nodded sympathetically. I wish I had a room for you, dear, but we're full up. Storm brought in some folks from the outlying ranches, and they're staying until the road's clear. If something opens up come spring, I'll let you know. Thank you, ma'am. Their last stop was the church. Reverend Stone was a man in his 60s, weathered and wise, with a reputation for practicality rather than judgment. He listened to their situation. Caleb explained it plainly, leaving nothing out, and nodded slowly. It's irregular, the Reverend said, but these are irregular times. You're both adults, you're both alone, and from what you tell me, Miss Brennan, you don't have many options. No, sir. Then my counsel is this. Live honestly. Keep your arrangement professional. Come to church on Sundays when you can. And he looked at Caleb directly. Treat her with the respect she deserves. She's entrusting her safety and her reputation to you. That's no small thing. I understand, Caleb said. Then God bless you both. And if you need anything, counsel, help, anything at all, my door is open. They left the church with a sense of relief. The Reverend's blessing wasn't quite the same as the town's acceptance, but it was something, a foundation to stand on. As they loaded the supplies onto the sledge, Clara said quietly, "Thank you for speaking up for me, for defending this arrangement. Nothing to defend. It's practical and sensible, and anyone who thinks otherwise can mind their own business. Still, it matters. You didn't have to do any of this." Caleb secured the last rope on the sledge and turned to face her. "Yes, I did. I don't know why exactly, but yes, I did, and I'm glad I did." Clara smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, made her look younger, less burdened. "I'm glad too." They rode back to the cabin through the afternoon light, and Caleb found himself thinking about time, about how it moved forward, whether you were ready or not, whether you were paying attention or not. He thought about his father's pocket watch, sitting in the trunk at the foot of his bed. It had stopped the day his father died, and Caleb had never wound it again, as if stopping the watch could stop time itself. But time hadn't stopped. It had kept moving, kept pushing him forward, kept bringing new days and new seasons. And now it had brought Clara Brennan into his life, and the watch was still stopped, and Caleb was beginning to think that maybe, just maybe, it was time to let time move again. That evening, after they'd unloaded the supplies and shared a quiet dinner, Clara asked him about the watch. She'd noticed it in his trunk when putting away her few belongings, and she asked about it with the careful courtesy of someone who knows they might be stepping on tender ground. Caleb took the watch out of the trunk and held it in his palm. It was silver, tarnished now, with his father's initials engraved on the case. T.D. for Thomas Dunn. "It stopped the day he died," Caleb said. "I never wound it again. Why not? Felt like if I wound it, I was accepting it. Accepting that he was gone and life was moving on without him. Felt disloyal somehow." Clara reached out and touched the watch gently. "May I?" He handed it to her. She opened the case carefully, examined the delicate mechanism inside, then looked up at him. "Do you know what I think?" "What?" "I think your father would want this watch to run, would want time to move forward for you, would want you to live, not just exist." The words hit harder than he expected. He took the watch back, holding it carefully, feeling the weight of it. 5 years of stopped time. 5 years of grief preserved in frozen gears. He wound the watch. The mechanism clicked softly, reluctantly, then caught. The second hand began to move, sweeping around the face in a smooth arc. The sound was tiny but distinct. Tick, tick, tick. "There," Clara said softly. "Time moving forward again." Caleb looked at her, and something passed between them. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. They were both broken people, both trying to piece together lives from scattered remnants. But maybe, together, they could manage what neither had managed alone, move forward instead of just surviving. That night, Caleb lay by the fire and listened to the watch ticking on the mantel. It was a small sound, easy to miss, but to him, it was everything. It was time moving, life continuing, hope, fragile and new but real. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and deeply right. Caleb worked the land and hired out to neighboring ranches when the weather allowed. Clara kept the cabin spotless, cooked meals that made the small space feel like home, and took in mending from town. Mrs. Havisham and a few others had work for her, and she attacked it with fierce precision. Evenings remained their shared time. Sometimes they'd talk, sometimes read, sometimes just sit in comfortable silence. Caleb taught Clara to play checkers using pieces carved from wood. She taught him a card game her father had shown her as a child. Small things, ordinary things, but they made the cold winter nights pass in warmth. The attraction between them grew, undeniable but unspoken. Caleb caught himself watching her as she worked, admiring the way lamplight caught in her dark hair, the grace of her hands as they moved through mending or cooking. Sometimes he'd look up to find her watching him, and their eyes would meet for a moment before one of them looked away. It was Clara's quilt that brought things to a head. She'd been working on it for weeks, piecing together scraps of fabric into a pattern that seemed random at first, but gradually revealed itself as deliberate and meaningful. She worked on it in the evenings, her needle flashing in the firelight, and when Caleb asked about it, she'd smile mysteriously and say, "You'll see when it's finished." 6 weeks into their arrangement, Samuel Burke came to call. Burke was a rancher, successful by local standards, with land that bordered Caleb's to the south. He was 40, widowed 3 years back, and according to George Havisham's gossip, looking for a new wife. He arrived on a cold afternoon, riding a good horse and wearing his best coat. "Dunn," he said, dismounting. "Heard you had a house guest. Thought I'd pay my respects." Caleb knew exactly what kind of respects Burke wanted to pay, but he invited him inside anyway. Clara served coffee and cake, perfectly polite and proper. Burke was charming, talking about his ranch, his plans for expansion, his comfortable home. "Miss Brennan," he said as he was leaving, "I wonder if I might call on you again. Perhaps take you to church on Sunday." Clara hesitated, glancing at Caleb. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Burke. May I think about it?" "Of course. I'll check back in a few days." After Burke left, the cabin felt too small and too quiet. Caleb busied himself with unnecessary tasks, trying not to think about Clara sitting in Burke's well-appointed parlor, eating off china plates instead of tin, sleeping in a proper bedroom instead of a cabin alcove. "You should consider it," he said finally, unable to help himself. "Burke's a good man, prosperous. He could give you security." Clara looked up from her mending. "Are you suggesting I should marry him?" "I'm suggesting you should think about your future, about what's best for you. And you think what's best for me is to marry a man I don't love for his money? I think what's best for you is to have options, to not be dependent on anyone's charity." "Charity?" Clara's eyes flashed. "Is that what you think this is?" "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean, Caleb?" "Because it sounds like you're trying to get rid of me. I'm trying to do right by you." The words came out harder than he intended. "You deserve better than this. Better than a run-down cabin and a man who can barely provide for himself, let alone a wife." He stopped, realizing what he'd said. The silence stretched out, painful and charged. Clara set down her mending very carefully. "Is that what you think?" she asked quietly. "That you're not enough?" Caleb couldn't look at her. "I know I'm not. You're wrong, Clara. You're wrong, Caleb Dunn. You saved my life. You gave me shelter and safety and kindness when I had nothing. You've treated me with more respect than any man I've ever known. You've made me laugh and given me purpose and—" She stopped, taking a breath. "And you've made me hope again. For the first time in years, I wake up hoping. So don't you dare tell me you're not enough." Caleb finally looked at her. She was standing now, her hands clenched at her sides, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "But Burke could give you security? Money? Status?" She shook her head. "I don't want those things. Or rather, I don't want them more than—" She stopped again, and this time she did look away. "More than what I have here. What do you have here?" Caleb asked, and his voice came out rough. "A home, a partner, a friend." She met his eyes again. "The possibility of more if you wanted it. If you weren't so determined to believe you don't deserve it." The words hung between them, honest and terrifying. Caleb wanted to reach for her, wanted to close the distance and say all the things he'd been thinking for weeks. But fear held him frozen, fear that he'd ruin this, that he'd take advantage, that he'd prove himself as unworthy as he believed. Clara saw it in his face. She nodded slowly, sadly, and picked up her mending again. "When Mr. Burke comes back, I'll decline his offer," she said quietly. "Not because you asked me to, because I don't want what he's offering. I want—" She stopped, shook her head. "I want what I can't have, apparently." She went to bed early that night, and Caleb sat by the fire for hours, hating himself, hating his cowardice, hating the fear that kept him from reaching for the happiness that was right there in front of him. The next morning, he rode out to check traps and think. The land was beautiful in its winter starkness. White snow, dark trees, blue sky. Clean and simple and empty. The way his life had been before Clara arrived, he didn't want that emptiness back. That was the truth he'd been avoiding. He'd gotten used to her presence, dependent on it even. The cabin felt wrong without her in it. Food tasted better when she cooked it. Evenings had meaning when she shared them. He'd spent 5 years building walls around himself, and she'd walked right through them without even trying. And now he didn't know how to be alone anymore. But that didn't mean he deserved her. Didn't mean she should settle for him when men like Burke could offer her so much more. Didn't mean— "You're an idiot," he said aloud to Ned, who was following him through the snow. "You know that." Ned snorted, which Caleb took as agreement. He checked the traps, empty, and started the long walk back to the cabin. The sun was setting, painting the snow gold and pink, beautiful and cold, like everything in this country. You either learned to see the beauty despite the cold, or the cold killed you. There was no middle ground. Maybe it was time to stop seeing Clara as an obligation and start seeing her as a choice. His choice. Maybe it was time to stop waiting for disaster and start building towards something good. Maybe. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats. He looked up to see Samuel Burke riding toward him. "Dunn!" Burke called out. "Got a minute?" They stood in the snow, two men with clouds of frozen breath between them, and Burke got right to the point. "I know you're looking out for Miss Brennan." "That's admirable. But I want you to know my intentions are honorable. I'm prepared to offer her marriage, a real home, financial security, a position in society, everything a woman could want." "That's so." Caleb kept his voice neutral. "It is. And I wanted to talk to you first, man to man. I know she's staying at your place, but I also know it's a temporary arrangement. Come spring, she'll need something more permanent. I'm offering that. Have you asked her?" "Not formally, but I plan to. Wanted to clear it with you first, given the situation." Caleb felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. "Clear it with me? I'm not her father or her brother. She makes her own decisions, of course. But I thought, given that you're housing her, you might have some say in—" "I don't," Caleb said flatly. "She's a free woman. She makes her own choices. If she wants to marry you, that's between you and her." Burke studied him for a moment. "But you care what she chooses. It wasn't a question." Caleb didn't answer it. Burke smiled, not unkindly. "Look, Dunn, I know you've gotten attached. Any man would. She's a fine woman. But be realistic. What can you offer her? A one-room cabin and a hard life? I can give her comfort. Children, if she wants them. A future worth having. Maybe comfort isn't everything. Maybe not. But it's not nothing either." Burke gathered his reins. "I'm riding to Denver next week on business. When I get back, I'll be calling on Miss Brennan formally. I wanted you to know. Professional courtesy." He rode off, leaving Caleb standing in the snow with Ned and the weight of his own inadequacy. Burke was right about everything. He could offer Clara more than Caleb ever could. A bigger house, financial security, social standing. All the things a practical woman should want. But Clara had said she didn't want those things. She'd said she wanted, what had she said? A home, a partner, a friend, the possibility of more. She'd as good as told him she wanted him, and he'd been too much of a coward to say he wanted her too. By the time Caleb got back to the cabin, it was full dark. He put Ned in the lean-to, fed him, and stood outside for a long moment, gathering his courage. Inside, Clara was cooking dinner. She looked up when he entered, and there was something guarded in her expression that made his chest ache. "There's stew," she said. "Should be ready soon. Clara, Mr. Burke came by earlier, said he'd spoken to you. Said he'd be calling on me formally when he returns from Denver." She stirred the pot carefully, not looking at him. "I told him not to bother. I'm not interested in his offer." "Why not?" She did look at him then, and there was fire in her eyes. "Because I'm not a piece of property to be passed from one man to another. Because I've had enough of men deciding what's best for me. And because—" She stopped, shook her head. "It doesn't matter. It does matter. Tell me, why? So you can tell me again how I should take Burke's offer because you're not good enough. How I deserve better than what you can give me." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm so tired of people telling me what I deserve, Caleb. I just want—" "What? What do you want?" "I want you to stop pushing me away." The words burst out of her, loud in the small space. "I want you to see what's right in front of you. I want you to be brave enough to reach for something good, instead of hiding behind your fear and your guilt and your conviction that you don't deserve happiness. I want—" Her voice broke. "I want you, you stubborn, infuriating, wonderful man. I want you." The silence that followed was absolute. Clara turned away, covering her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. Caleb stood frozen, her words ringing in his ears. She wanted him. Not Burke with his money and his big house, him, Caleb Dunn, with his one-room cabin and his stopped watch and his 5 years of running from anything that might hurt him. He crossed the room in 3 strides, took her by the shoulders and turned her to face him. Tears streaked her cheeks and she tried to turn away, but he wouldn't let her. "I'm not good with words," he said. "Never have been. But I need you to listen." She nodded, not quite meeting his eyes. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Terrified, actually. I haven't let myself care about anyone in 5 years because caring hurts, and I wasn't strong enough to survive losing anyone else. But then you showed up, half frozen in the snow, and I brought you home and you—" He stopped, searching for words. "You brought light into this place, into me. And the thought of you leaving, of watching you walk away, that scares me more than anything. Then why did you push me toward Burke? Because I thought that's what you deserved. Because I thought I'd be selfish to ask you to choose this," he gestured at the cabin, "when you could have so much more. This is all I want," Clara said, and her voice was fierce. "This cabin, this life, you. Why can't you believe that?" "Because I'm an idiot," Caleb said, "and a coward. And I almost let the best thing that ever happened to me walk away because I was too afraid to believe I could be enough." "You are enough," Clara said, and she reached up to touch his face. "You've always been enough." He kissed her then, finally, after weeks of wanting to. It was gentle and desperate all at once, his hands cradling her face, her fingers tangling in his shirt. It was forgiveness and promise and relief all mixed together. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he said. "Not as a housekeeper or an employee. Stay as—" he fumbled for the words. "As my partner, my equal. The person I want to build a life with. Are you asking me to marry you? Eventually, if you'll have me. But right now, I'm just asking you to choose this. To choose me. To choose us." Clara smiled through her tears. "I already have. I chose you weeks ago. I've just been waiting for you to catch up." They stood there in the middle of the cabin, holding each other, and Caleb felt something inside him unlock, some tight, frightened thing that had been clenched shut for 5 years. The watch ticked on the mantel, time moving forward, and for once Caleb was ready to move with it. Outside, winter pressed against the walls. But inside there was warmth and light and the beginning of something worth having. Not perfect maybe, not easy, but real and chosen, and theirs. Mail arrived from the east on a cold day in late February. Caleb was in town picking up supplies when the postmaster flagged him down. "Got something for your house guest," he said, handing over a thick packet. "Looks official." Caleb brought it back to the cabin where Clara was working on her quilt, the project that had occupied her evenings for weeks. She looked up when he entered, smiled that smile that still made his heart stutter, and then saw the packet in his hands. "What is it?" "Don't know. It's addressed to you." From Philadelphia. She took it carefully, as if it might bite, opened it with trembling hands. "Read the first page, then the second." Her face went pale, then flushed, then pale again. "Clara, what is it?" She handed him the letter wordlessly. He read it twice, trying to make sense of the legal language. But the gist was clear. Clara's aunt, her father's sister, whom she'd never known existed, had died 6 months ago and left her entire estate to Clara. A property in a good Philadelphia neighborhood. Money in trust. Not a fortune, but enough to live on independently for years. "I don't understand," Clara said faintly. "I didn't even know I had an aunt. Says here she was estranged from your father. Tried to find you after your parents died, but couldn't locate you. Hired investigators. They tracked you through the mail-order bride correspondence." Caleb kept reading. "You have to respond to the lawyer. Claim the inheritance. Make arrangements." Clara sank into a chair, staring at nothing. "I could go back east. I could have my own home. Financial independence. I could—" She stopped, looked at Caleb. "I could do anything I wanted." Something cold wrapped around Caleb's heart. This was it, the moment he'd been dreading without knowing he was dreading it. She had choices now. Real choices. She didn't need him or his cabin or this hard Wyoming life. She could go back to civilization, to comfort, to the world she'd come from. He had to clear his throat. "That's wonderful news. I'm happy for you." She looked at him strangely. "Are you?" "Of course. You deserve this. You deserve to have options, to build the life you want. The life I want," she repeated slowly. And what makes you think I don't have that here? Clara, this is—" he gestured at the letter. "This is freedom, security, everything you came west looking for." "I came west looking for a home," she said. "I found one, but now you don't need—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "Need what? You?" Her eyes were sharp now, bright with something that might have been anger or hurt or both. "Is that what you think this has been about? Necessity? I think you've made the best of a bad situation. But now you have a way out. A good way out. You'd be crazy not to take it." Clara stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the snow-covered land. When she spoke, her voice was very calm. "So you want me to go? I want you to do what's best for you. Stop." She turned to face him. "Stop hiding behind what you think is noble. Do you want me to go? Yes or no?" The truth was a physical pain in his chest. "No," he admitted. "I don't want you to go. But that doesn't matter. It's the only thing that matters." She crossed the room, stood in front of him. "This inheritance doesn't change anything. I still want to be here. I still want to build a life with you. The only question is whether you want the same thing. Of course I want—" He stopped, looked at the letter in his hands. "But this changes everything. You have choices now. You're not trapped here by circumstance. If you stay, it should be because it's what you really want, not because what? Not because I'm grateful to you? Not because I feel obligated?" She shook her head. "Caleb, I stayed because I wanted to. I stay because I want to. This inheritance doesn't change that. It just means I'm choosing you freely, without any external pressure. Isn't that what you wanted?" It was, it absolutely was. But the fear was still there, clawing at him. What if you change your mind? What if you wake up one day and realize you gave up financial security for a hard-scrabble life with a man who can barely— "Then that will be my choice and my responsibility," Clara interrupted. "Stop trying to protect me from my own decisions. I'm a grown woman. I know what I want. The question is, do you trust me enough to believe me? Do you trust me?" That was the heart of it, wasn't it? Not whether he was worthy of her, but whether he could trust that her choice was real and lasting. Whether he could believe that someone might actually choose him, not out of necessity or gratitude, but out of genuine want. "I trust you," he said finally. "I'm just afraid—" "I know. So am I. But being afraid isn't a reason not to try." She was right. She was completely right. And he was being an idiot again, trying to push away the best thing in his life because he was too scared to believe in it. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "About the inheritance?" Clara looked at the letter thoughtfully. "I want to write to the lawyer, tell him to sell the property, put the money in trust. We can use it to improve this place, maybe buy some of the adjacent land, fix up the cabin, get proper equipment. Build something real here. You'd spend your inheritance on this place." "It's not just this place. It's our place, our future. If you'll have me." He should say something romantic, something worthy of the moment. But all he could manage was, "Yes, God, yes." She smiled, and it was like the sun coming out. "Then we'll write the lawyer together. Tell him my intentions. And then—" she glanced at the quilt project on her chair. "And then I have something to show you." "The quilt?" "It's finished. Or nearly. Come here." She picked up the quilt and spread it out on the table. It was beautiful, a patchwork of different fabrics in blues and browns and whites, all sewn together in a pattern that seemed random, but wasn't. "Each piece tells a story," Clara said, touching the squares gently. "This blue fabric, it's from the dress I was wearing when you found me. My beginning here. This brown, from your shirt that I mended, the first time you let me help you. This white, from flour sacking, from the first batch of bread I made that actually turned out right. This dark blue, from the curtains in your mother's recipe book, our connection to the past. This checkered piece, from a dish towel, from all the dinners we've shared. This gray, from one of Ned's blankets because he's family too." She moved around the quilt, pointing to each square, telling the story of their time together. The storm, the meals, the laughter, the growing connection. Each piece was a memory, a moment, a choice she'd made to stay. "I've been piecing together our life," Clara said softly. "Building something whole from broken pieces. That's what this quilt is. That's what we are. Two people who were broken, building something new together. Caleb couldn't speak. He reached out and touched the quilt, feeling the careful stitches, the love and intention in every seam. "I choose this," Clara said, taking his hand. "I choose you. I choose here, not because I have to, because I want to, because this is where I belong." He pulled her to him then, holding her tight, his face buried in her hair. "I choose you too," he said against her neck. "I choose us. I choose this life we're building." They stood there for a long moment, holding each other. The quilt spread between them like a map of where they'd been and where they were going. "We should probably write that letter to the lawyer," Clara said eventually. "Probably," Caleb agreed. But neither of them moved. There would be time for letters and lawyers and practical matters. Right now there was just this. Two people who'd found each other in a storm and chosen to keep finding each other every day since. Outside, winter still held the land in its grip. But inside, there was warmth and light and the promise of spring to come. The weeks that followed were strange ones. Clara wrote to the lawyer, outlining her decisions about the inheritance. Caleb tried not to second-guess her choice, tried to believe that she knew her own mind. But doubt crept in during the quiet moments. Was she making a mistake? Would she regret it? Clara seemed to sense his thoughts. She'd look at him with that knowing expression and say, "Stop it. I'm not having second thoughts. Are you?" And he'd have to admit he wasn't, that the thought of her leaving was worse than any fear of inadequacy. Burke returned from Denver in early March. He came to the cabin one afternoon, dressed in his best clothes, clearly prepared to make his formal proposal. Caleb felt his jaw tighten when he saw the man ride up, but Clara touched his arm gently. "Let me handle this," she said. She met Burke outside, and Caleb watched through the window as they talked. Burke was animated, gesturing, clearly making his case. Clara listened politely, then shook her head. She said something. Caleb couldn't hear what, and Burke's face fell. They talked for another minute, then shook hands formally. Burke mounted his horse and rode away without looking back. "What did you tell him?" Caleb asked when Clara came back inside. "The truth. That I appreciate his offer, but I'm not available. That I've made my choice and I'm happy with it." She hung up her shawl. "He took it well, actually. Wished me happiness. Said if I ever change my mind, the offer stands. Will you? Change your mind?" She crossed the room and took his face in her hands. "No, you stubborn man. I won't. When are you going to believe that?" "I'm trying. Try harder." But she smiled when she said it and kissed him to take the sting out of the words. That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. He lay by the fire, listening to Clara's quiet breathing from the alcove, and thought about the future, about what he wanted to offer her versus what he had to offer, about the gap between those two things and whether it was too wide to bridge. Finally, he got up and lit the lantern, pulled out paper and pencil, tools he rarely used, and started to write. It came slowly at first, the words awkward and clumsy. He wasn't educated like Clara was, hadn't read as many books or written many letters, but he had things to say, and somehow, in the quiet darkness, with the scratch of pencil on paper and the tick of his father's watch on the mantel, the words came. He wrote about finding her in the snow, about the weeks trapped in the cabin together, but the way she'd brought light back into his life without trying. He wrote about his fears, that he wasn't enough, that he'd fail her, that she'd wake up one day and realize she'd made a terrible mistake. But he also wrote about his hopes, about the life they could build together, about children maybe, and a bigger cabin, and land that they'd work side by side, about growing old together, about facing whatever came with a partner beside him, about love. The word felt dangerous to write, but he wrote it anyway because it was true. He wrote that he loved her, that he'd probably loved her since that first week, when she'd laughed at Ned's stubbornness and made him remember what joy sounded like, that he wanted to spend the rest of his life earning the right to her presence, that he knew he wasn't worthy, but he'd spend every day trying to be. When he finished, dawn was breaking outside. He read the letter over once, winced at the clumsy phrasing and crossed out words, and almost threw it in the fire. But something stopped him. Maybe it was honest, even if it wasn't eloquent. Maybe that was enough. He folded the letter and left it on his workbench in the lean-to. He'd decide later what to do with it, maybe burn it, Maybe keep it, maybe someday show it to Clara. Right now, he just needed to write it, to get the words out of his head and onto paper where they could exist outside the prison of his own thoughts. He went to check the traps, needing the cold air and the solitude to clear his head. Ned followed him, patient and steady as always. They walked through the snow, and Caleb thought about Burke's visit, about Clara's inheritance, about all the ways this could still fall apart. When he got back to the cabin hours later, Clara was in the lean-to, and she was holding his letter. Caleb stopped in the doorway, his heart hammering. "That wasn't, you weren't meant to—" "I was looking for you," Clara said. "Thought you might be here. I saw this on the bench and—" She looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears. "Caleb, I'm sorry. It's clumsy and poorly written, and it's perfect." She crossed to him, the letter clutched in her hand. "It's everything I needed to hear, everything I hoped you felt, but was afraid you didn't. You read it all. Every word." She touched his face gently. "You really love me?" "Yes," he said, and it felt like the most honest word he'd ever spoken. "I really do. I know I haven't said it before. I know I've been too much of a coward to—" She kissed him, stopping the words. When she pulled back, she was smiling through her tears. "I love you too," she said. "I have for weeks. I just didn't know if we—" She laughed, shaky and relieved. "We're both idiots, aren't we?" "Seems like. So what do we do now?" Caleb took the letter from her hand and set it aside. Then he took her hands in his, formal and a little awkward, and said what he should have said weeks ago. "Clara Brennan, will you marry me? Not someday, not eventually, soon as we can arrange it. Will you be my wife?" "Yes," she said immediately. "Yes, absolutely yes." He pulled the pocket watch from his vest, his father's watch, still ticking, still keeping time. He opened the case and showed her the inside. There was a small space there, and in it was a lock of hair. His mother's, brown and still glossy despite the years. "This is all I have of my family," he said. "All I have of the people I loved and lost. I was thinking—" He stopped, suddenly uncertain. "I was thinking maybe I could add a lock of your hair, if you wanted, so you'd be part of that family, part of what I carry with me." Clara's tears spilled over. That's the most beautiful thing anyone's ever said to me. Is that a yes?" "That's a yes to everything. To marriage, to family, to carrying each other forward. To all of it." They stood in the cold lean-to, holding each other, and Caleb felt something he'd thought he'd lost forever. Absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Ned chose that moment to bray loudly, as if offering commentary on the proceedings. They both laughed, and Clara went to pet the donkey's nose. "He approves," she said. "Good. I'd hate to have to negotiate with him." They went back to the cabin, and Clara pulled out her sewing scissors. She cut a small lock of her dark hair, and Caleb added it to the watch case beside his mother's. 2 generations, 2 families, joined together in a tiny silver space. "We'll make our own family now," Clara said softly. "Build our own traditions. But we'll carry them with us, your parents, my parents, everyone we've lost. They'll be part of what we build." "Together," Caleb agreed. Together. They planned the wedding for early April, as soon as the roads were clear enough for Reverend Stone to make the trip out to the cabin. They wanted it simple, just close friends, no fuss. A ceremony that reflected who they were, rather than who they should be. Clara used some of the fabric she'd saved to make a simple dress. Nothing fancy, just good wool in a deep blue that made her eyes look almost black. She sewed it by firelight, and Caleb watched her work, marveling at the skill in her hands, the focus on her face. "You're staring," she said without looking up. "Can't help it. You're beautiful when you work." She blushed, which made him smile. After weeks of living together, you'd think they'd be past blushing. But there was something about the certainty of their future that made everything feel new again. Caleb used the money he'd saved to buy silver from the general store. Not much, just enough for 2 simple wedding bands. But instead of having them made in town, he did something else. He melted down the case of his father's pocket watch. It took him 3 tries to get it right, working late at night in the lean-to with a makeshift forge. The mechanism he kept carefully preserved, along with the locks of hair. But the silver case he transformed, reshaping the past into something new. When he was done, he had two simple bands, a little uneven, clearly handmade, but perfect in their imperfection. They were light, almost delicate, but strong. Like everything else in this territory, they'd been forged in fire. Clara cried when he showed them to her. "Your father's watch is still keeping time," Caleb said, showing her the mechanism, now housed in a simple wooden case he'd carved. "Just in a different form. He'd understand, I think. Using the past to build the future. It's perfect," she whispered. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, with blue skies stretching from horizon to horizon. Reverend Stone arrived at mid-morning, along with Mrs. Kelly from the boarding house and George Havisham and his wife. Samuel Burke came too, which surprised Caleb until Burke pulled him aside. "No hard feelings," Burke said. "She chose well. And so did you. Be good to her." "I will. I believe you." They held the ceremony in the cabin, with Ned watching through the window, his breath fogging the glass. Clara wore her blue dress and carried wildflowers that she'd somehow found blooming in a sheltered spot near the creek. Caleb wore his only suit, brushed clean and pressed as well as he could manage. Reverend Stone kept it simple. "We're here to witness the union of Caleb and Clara, two souls who found each other in the hardest of seasons and chose to build a life together. In a land that demands resilience and courage, they offer us an example of what's possible when we're brave enough to hope." Caleb spoke his vows, hands shaking slightly as he held Clara's. "I promise to be your partner in all things, to respect your strength and support you in weakness, to laugh with you in good times and stand beside you in hard ones, to build a life worthy of your trust, to honor you, to care for you, and to love you for all my days." Clara's voice was steady and clear. "I promise to be your home as you've been mine, to face this life with courage, knowing you're beside me, to laugh, to work, to build, to dream, to honor your past while helping create our future, to love you, to trust you, and to choose you every day for the rest of my life." They exchanged the silver rings, forged from the past, worn for the future. And when Reverend Stone pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb kissed her with a sense of rightness so profound it felt like grace. The celebration afterward was modest. Mrs. Kelly had brought a cake, George Havisham contributed whiskey, and someone had brought a fiddle. They ate and drank and danced in the small cabin, and for a few hours the hardship of Wyoming life fell away, replaced by simple joy. As evening approached and the guests departed, Caleb and Clara stood on the porch, watching the sun set over their land. Their land. Their home. "Happy?" Caleb asked. "More than I ever thought possible," Clara said. "You?" "Same." They stood in comfortable silence, his arm around her shoulders, her head against his chest. The wind carried the smell of sage and snow, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called. "We should go inside," Clara said eventually. "It's getting cold." In a minute. Caleb wanted to hold this moment a little longer, the peace of it, the certainty. He'd spent so long running from happiness, convinced he didn't deserve it. But standing here with Clara beside him, her ring on his finger and his on hers, he finally understood what his father's watch had been trying to tell him all along. Time moves forward. The only choice is whether you move with it or get left behind. "Caleb?" Clara looked up at him. "What are you thinking? That I'm the luckiest man alive? That I found you when I'd stopped looking for anything? That sometimes the best things come when you least expect them? Sometimes they come in blizzards," Clara added with a smile. "Sometimes they do." They went inside together, closing the door against the cold, and began the first night of their married life in a cabin that had once been a prison of solitude and was now a home full of promise. Spring came slowly to Wyoming, as it always did. The snow melted in fits and starts, revealing brown grass and muddy ground. But life returned with it. Wildflowers pushing through the last patches of snow, birds returning from the south, the land waking from its long sleep. Caleb and Clara worked together to improve the cabin. They used part of Clara's inheritance to buy lumber and supplies. Caleb built an addition, a proper bedroom separate from the main room, and a small workshop for Clara where she could do her sewing. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Built with their own hands and their shared vision, they bought the adjacent 40 acres from a widow who was moving back east. 80 acres now, enough to run a small cattle operation, to plant a garden big enough to sustain them, to build something lasting. They'd got a companion, a young mule Clara named Daisy, and the two animals became inseparable despite their differences in size and temperament. Clara's sewing business grew. Women from town began seeking her out for her fine work, and she took on projects ranging from wedding dresses to quilt repairs. The money wasn't much, but it was hers, earned through her skill, and she took pride in it. Caleb continued working for neighboring ranches, but now he could afford to be selective about which jobs he took. He focused on the ones that let him sleep in his own bed most nights, unwilling to spend more time away from Clara than necessary. They planted a garden together that spring, vegetables for eating, herbs for cooking and medicine, and a small plot of wildflowers that Clara insisted on because we need beauty, not just utility. Caleb pretended to grumble about wasting good soil on flowers, but Clara caught him smiling as he planted the seeds. In June, they made their first trip to town as a married couple. The transformation in how people treated them was subtle but noticeable. Before, there had been curiosity and barely concealed judgment. Now there was acceptance. They were no longer the scandalous arrangement, but simply the Dunns, a young couple working hard to build a life. Mrs. Havisham pulled Clara aside in the general store. "I wanted to apologize," she said quietly, "for how I behaved when you first arrived, for the assumptions I made. You've proven yourself a good woman and a good wife, and I'm sorry I doubted it." Clara accepted the apology with grace. "We all make judgments we regret. I'm just glad we've moved past it." That night, sitting on their porch with coffee and watching the stars come out, Clara told Caleb about the apology. "People can surprise you," she said. "Oh, given the chance." "You've taught me that," Caleb admitted. "I'd written off the whole world. Thought the only safe thing was to stay alone. You proved me wrong. We proved each other wrong. You didn't think you deserved happiness. I didn't think I'd ever find a real home. Turns out we were both mistaken. The summer passed in hard work and simple pleasures. Long days in the fields, short nights in their new bedroom. Clara's garden flourished, and they canned vegetables for winter. Caleb repaired fences and built a new shed. They danced in the cabin on rainy evenings, laughing at their own clumsiness. They rode together through their land, planning future improvements, dreaming aloud. In August, Clara had news. She told him over breakfast, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, her eyes both nervous and excited. "I think I'm expecting," she said simply. Caleb nearly dropped his fork. "You think?" "I'm fairly certain. I've missed 2 monthlies, and I've been feeling," she gestured vaguely, "different. In the ways you're supposed to feel." He was around the table in an instant, dropping to his knees beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "A baby?" "A baby," she confirmed, and now she was smiling. "Are you happy?" "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it." He pulled her into his arms, careful suddenly, as if she might break. "When?" "Late winter, I think. February or March, a baby." His child. Their child. The family he'd thought he'd lost forever, rebuilt from ashes and second chances. "We'll need a bigger bed," he said, and Clara laughed. "We'll need a lot of things, but we'll figure it out. We always do." They told Reverend Stone first, then Mrs. Kelly, then let the news spread naturally through the small community. The reactions were universally positive. Congratulations, offers of help, advice from other mothers. Clara was folded into a network of women she hadn't known existed, receiving wisdom, both practical and superstitious, about pregnancy and childbirth. Caleb threw himself into preparing. He built a cradle in the evenings, sanding the wood smooth so no splinter could harm his child. He reinforced the cabin's walls against the coming winter, determined that his son or daughter would be born into a warm, safe home. He worked longer hours, saved more money, planned obsessively for every contingency. "You're going to wear yourself out," Clara said one evening. Watching him work on the cradle by lamplight, want it to be perfect. It already is. The baby won't care if the cradle is perfectly sanded. The baby will just care that we're here. I want to give them everything. Everything I didn't have. Everything. Caleb. Clara took the sandpaper from his hand and made him look at her. You're already giving them everything that matters. A home, parents who love each other, safety and stability. That's more than most children get. More than either of us had. She was right, he knew. But the fear was there anyway. That he'd fail at this, that he wouldn't be enough, that his child would suffer for his inadequacies. I'm scared, he admitted. So am I. But we'll figure it out together. Like we figure out everything else. Autumn came, painting the land in gold and rust. Clara's belly swelled, and Caleb found himself constantly amazed by the physical reality of the life growing inside her. He talked to the baby sometimes, his hand on Clara's stomach, telling stories or making promises or just saying hello. You're going to be a wonderful father, Clara said one evening, watching him. You really think so? I know so. I've watched you with Ned and Daisy. I've seen how patient and gentle you can be. You'll be the same with our child. Animals are easier than children, maybe, but the love is the same. And you have so much love to give, Caleb. You've just been afraid to give it. But not anymore. She was right about that too. The walls he'd built around his heart had come down, brick by brick, over the past year. Clara had torn some down. The baby was demolishing the rest. He was defenseless now, vulnerable to hurt in a way he hadn't been since before his parents died. But he was also alive in a way he hadn't been in years. Really alive, not just surviving. Winter came early that year, with the first snow falling in November. But the cabin was ready, stocked with supplies, warm and tight, the cradle waiting in the corner. They settled in for the long months ahead, and Caleb found himself grateful for the forced stillness. These might be the last quiet months they'd have for years. Once the baby came, everything would change. Clara grew larger, moved slower, tired more easily. Caleb took over more of the household work, learning to cook from the recipe book, to mend his own clothes when Clara was too exhausted. He didn't mind. This was what partnership meant, carrying each other through the hard times, balancing strengths and weaknesses, working as a team. On a cold night in February, Clara woke him from sleep. Caleb, she said quietly. It's time. He was up instantly, heart hammering. Are you sure? I'm sure. She was breathing carefully, one hand on her belly. The pain started an hour ago. They're getting closer together. They'd prepared for this. Mrs. Kelly was supposed to come to help with the birth. But a quick look outside showed fresh snow falling heavily. No way to get to town and back in time. I'll ride for Mrs. Kelly, Caleb said, pulling on his boots. There's no time. Clara's voice was calm despite the fear in her eyes. It's coming fast, Caleb. You're going to have to help me. I don't know how. We'll figure it out. Like we figure out everything else, so they did. Through the long hours of labor, Caleb stayed beside her, following her instructions, doing what needed doing despite his terror. He'd helped birth calves and foals, but this was different. This was Clara in pain, depending on him. This was his child, fighting to enter the world. Dawn was breaking when the baby finally came. A girl, small and red-faced and screaming with impressive volume. Caleb caught her in trembling hands, wrapped her in blankets they'd kept warm by the fire, and placed her on Clara's chest. A daughter, Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face. We have a daughter. She's perfect, Caleb said, and his voice cracked. You're both perfect. They named her Rose after Clara's mother. Rose Dunn, born in a Wyoming cabin during a February snowstorm, welcomed into the world by parents who'd been broken and lost and had somehow found their way to wholeness. Those first weeks were the hardest and most beautiful of Caleb's life. Sleepless nights, constant worry, the overwhelming responsibility of keeping this tiny person alive. But also joy, pure, uncomplicated joy. Rose's first smile, her tiny hand gripping his finger, the way she'd quiet when he spoke to her, as if she knew his voice. You're a natural, Clara said one evening, watching him rock Rose to sleep. Don't know about that. Feel like I'm making it up as I go. That's what all parents do. But you're doing it well. Spring returned, and with it came renewal. The garden needed planting again. Fences needed mending. The land demanded work, as it always did. But now there were 3 of them to meet those demands. And somehow that made everything easier. They fell into new rhythms, Clara caring for Rose while Caleb worked the land. Both of them sharing the nighttime duties, stealing moments of rest when they could. It was exhausting and demanding, and nothing like the quiet life they'd had before. It was better. One evening in late March, nearly a year after their wedding, they sat on the porch together. Rose slept in Clara's arms, wrapped in the quilt Clara had made, the one that told the story of their beginning. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. "Are you happy?" Clara asked, echoing the question from their wedding day. Caleb looked at his wife and daughter, at the cabin behind them that they'd built into a home, at the land stretching out before them, full of promise and possibility. "Happier than I ever thought possible," he said, and meant it absolutely. "You?" "I'm home," Clara said simply, and that said everything. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset, and Caleb thought about the journey that had brought them here. A blizzard, a stranger collapsed in the snow, a moment of compassion that had changed everything. Sometimes the hardest winters really did bring the most unexpected blessings. Sometimes lost souls found each other against all odds. Sometimes broken people built something whole and beautiful from their scattered pieces, not because it was easy, not because it was guaranteed, but because they chose it every day and kept choosing it even when it was hard, because that's what love was, not a single moment of recognition or a fairy tale promise, but a series of small choices made over and over, choosing trust over fear, choosing hope over despair, choosing each other day after day, building a life one choice at a time. "What are you thinking about?" Clara asked. "The watch," Caleb said. "How I kept it stopped for so long, trying to freeze time, trying to live in the past because I was too afraid of the future. And now..." He pulled the watch from his pocket, still running, still keeping time. The mechanism housed in the wooden case he'd carved, the silver transformed into the rings on their fingers. "Now I understand that time isn't the enemy. It's the gift. Every moment that passes is another moment we get to spend together. Another moment of this life we're building. Why would I want to stop that?" Clara smiled and leaned her head against his shoulder. Rose stirred but didn't wake. The sun touched the horizon, turning the world gold. "Tell me something," Clara said. "If you could go back to that day, the day you found me in the snow, and know everything that was coming, would you still stop?" Caleb didn't even have to think about it. "Every time, in every lifetime. I'd stop every time, even knowing how hard it would be, how scared you'd be, especially knowing that. Because I'd also know how good it would get, how worth it you'd be, how worth it all of this would be." They sat until the stars came out, 3 people who'd been lost and alone, finding themselves together. The wind carried the smell of sage and new grass, and somewhere in the barn, Ned brayed his goodnight to the world. It wasn't a perfect life. The work would still be hard, winters would still be brutal. There would be challenges ahead, lean years, hard times, the 100 small crises that came with making a life in unforgiving country. But they'd face it together, and that made all the difference. Inside the cabin, on the mantel, his father's watch ticked steadily onward. Time moving forward, carrying them with it, toward whatever came next. And for once, Caleb Dunn wasn't afraid of the future. He was looking forward to it.